For 8 long years, Elijah Carr lived alone at the edge of the high plains where the wind howled through brittle grass and time passed without witness. He had no neighbors, no visitors, and no desire for either. His only companion was a weathered horse named Dusty, and together they tended a modest ranch that hadn't heard laughter since the day everything ended. Elijah hadn't always been a man of silence. Once, his home had been full, his wife Lydia with her gentle voice and quick wit, their daughter Clara chasing chickens and picking wildflowers. But one spring afternoon, when Elijah opened his gate to 3 strangers claiming to be travelers in need, his kindness cost him everything. By the time he returned from fetching water, smoke billowed from the barn, and 2 gunshots split the air like thunder. The men had stolen his horse, ransacked his pantry, and taken from him the only 2 souls that ever made life worth living. From that day on, Elijah shut the world out, boarded his windows, and buried his heart with his family on the hill behind the pasture. Then came the night of the storm. The wind carried with it not just rain, but something unfamiliar, voices. At first, he thought it was a trick of memory, ghosts whispering from the past. But when he stepped out with a lantern in hand, he saw them 10 women, soaked to the bone, eyes hollow from exhaustion, standing just outside his gate. The one at the front stepped forward, her voice barely louder than the rain. She said her name was Nita, and they needed shelter for just 1 night. Elijah stared at her, his gut tightening. They were Apache, every one of them. The same blood as the tribes blamed for countless raids and tensions, but these women didn't look like raiders. They looked hunted. He should have turned them away. Every instinct born of loss told him to close the door, bolt it, and pretend he hadn't heard them. But there was something in Nita's face, some quiet dignity, some unbearable grief that broke through the wall he'd built for years. He opened the door. Inside, he built a fire and passed out blankets. No one spoke much, but their eyes said more than words ever could. Over time, through glances and halting conversations, Nita told him they were survivors' wives, sisters, daughters of a village burned to the ground by soldiers sent by a man named Captain Thatcher. He and his men were hunting the last witnesses to what they'd done, torching homes, slaying families, silencing those who might speak. The women had escaped and walked for days, hoping to find somewhere they wouldn't be slaughtered for breathing. They had chosen Elijah's ranch not by accident, but because it was remote, hard to reach, and easy to defend, and they hadn't come unprepared. These women had trained. Some bore hidden knives, others knew the land like the backs of their hands. And Nita, she wasn't just a survivor, she was a strategist. She saw in Elijah not just a man with a roof, but a soul that might still care, if only given reason. When Thatcher's men arrived 2 nights later, they expected frightened women. Instead, they met resistance. Elijah fired the first shot from the barn loft, dropping a soldier before his boot touched the porch. Nita and her companions unleashed their fury with precision, turning the ranch into a trap. The air filled with smoke and gunfire. When it ended, Captain Thatcher lay dying in the mud, and Nita stood over him, silent and unflinching. But the battle wasn't over. Just after dawn, a second force approached, larger, better armed, and led by Colonel Sam Bradley. Nita proposed using dynamite to blow the entire front field sky high the moment the soldiers crossed it. Elijah agreed until he spotted something through his spyglass. A woman, a cook, maybe, and a baby. Not more than a few months old, bundled against her chest. They were in the middle of the field. The plan was off. Instead, Elijah led a quiet flanking strike from the back. With 2 of the women, he snuck around the ridge and disabled the guards near the supply wagons. In the chaos, they snatched the mother and child to safety. But in the skirmish, Nita captured Colonel Bradley's son young, angry, and full of fire. She wanted to end him. Elijah didn't. "We don't kill boys for the crimes of their fathers," he said. "We make them live with the truth." At sunrise, the sound of hooves thundered from the horizon, but this time, It wasn't soldiers. It was federal agents. Someone had tipped them off. Colonel Bradley was arrested, the boy shaken, silent. But Alive told the agents what he'd seen, and the empire of lies Thatcher and Bradley had built began to crumble. When it was all over, Nita and the surviving women left, protected now by federal decree. Elijah's ranch had been burned in the fight, but something inside him had rekindled. He chose not to rebuild alone. Instead, he saddled Dusty and offered to escort the young mother and her child to safety. The prairie behind him held memories of pain. Yes, but also now of courage, and of women who had come to his door not to beg, but to fight for the right to survive. Elijah Carr, once a man haunted by loss, rode east beneath the rising sun, carrying not just others but at long last, himself towards something worth living for. The rain came down in sheets that night, drumming on the tin roof like warning drums from a forgotten war. Micah Ellsworth sat near the hearth, sharpening a knife out of habit, not need. 8 years of solitude had etched silence into his bones, and the only sound he welcomed anymore was the soft crackle of firewood. Dust and wind were his only companions, and that was by design. Then came the knock. At first he thought it was the wind banging the shutters, but it came again, firmer, urgent. He stood slowly, the knife still in his hand, when he opened the door. His lantern's glow spilled onto the porch and revealed a sight that pulled breath from his chest. 10 women stood in the storm, drenched, their clothes soaked and clinging, faces drawn from exhaustion and fear. Apache, every one of them. They didn't carry weapons that he could see, but their posture held purpose. A woman near the front stepped forward, her dark hair plastered to her face, voice steady despite the cold. She said her name was Alawa. They needed shelter for one night, just until the storm passed. Her words were calm, but behind them was a tension that made Micah grip the knife tighter without realizing. He didn't answer right away. The sight of them stirred things in him he had long buried, memories of Clara, of that night, of what trust had cost him. His wife and daughter gone because he'd opened his gate to the wrong people. He'd vowed never again. No exceptions, but something in Alawa's eyes held him. Not pity, not desperation, something closer to strength. It struck him strange, 10 women. No men, out here in the middle of a storm. Something was wrong. He stepped aside, inside. The air was warmer, and the women peeled off wet shawls and sat near the fire without a word of thanks. Not out of rudeness, but because words had likely been used up long before reaching his door. Alawa stayed standing. Her gaze didn't wander like the others. She watched him with caution, the kind born from too many betrayals. After a while, when the wind died enough to hear more than just rain, she spoke again, not in plea this time, but in explanation. They weren't simply lost, they were running. Micah listened in silence as Alawa told him about what had happened just 3 days before. A village hers burned to ash by soldiers under Captain Harlan Boone. No warning. No reason beyond suspicion and the whim of a man who wanted obedience, not peace. The women in Micah's cabin had survived only because they were gathering herbs far from the village when the soldiers came. When they returned, there was nothing left. Just smoke, silence, and the scattered remains of the ones they loved. Boone didn't stop there. He sent men after them. To erase witnesses, 10 women running through the wilderness weren't just survivors, they were liabilities. And if they didn't find shelter soon, they'd be found and executed as if they were the ones who had drawn blood. Micah didn't speak for a long while after she finished. His gut twisted with familiar dread. Soldiers, authority unchecked, lies told louder than the truth. He knew that world too well. He had once worn a badge, once believed that justice came with a uniform. Until it didn't, he stared at the fire, then at the 10 women drying their feet on his floor, and finally at the knife still resting in his palm. Slowly, deliberately, he set it down. "They'll come looking here," he said. "You know that." "Right," Alawa nodded. "We're counting on it." That was when he realized they weren't hiding. They were preparing. The next morning, as the rain cleared and the air turned cold and bright, Micah noticed how the women moved around his cabin. One repaired the window shutter that had come loose. Another inventoried supplies in the kitchen. A third stood outside, surveying the surrounding hills like a scout. These weren't just traumatized widows. They were warriors trained, observant and methodical. They had chosen his ranch not out of desperation but for its tactical advantage. It was isolated, high-grounded, with clear lines of sight in every direction. He should have felt used. Instead, he felt awakened. For years, Micah had lived as a ghost, afraid that stepping into the world again would mean more loss. But these women had brought the world to him. And rather than crumble, he felt something stir that he thought long dead purpose. That night, as the moon crested over the ridge and the valley sank into quiet, Alawa sat beside him near the fire. She didn't ask for his help. She didn't have to. He spoke first. "If they come, we hold them here." She looked at him, surprised. "You sure know," he said, "but I'm tired of hiding from ghosts." And with that, a new fire lit behind his eyes, one that matched the storm still rolling inside every woman who had knocked on his door. Jeremiah Sloan stood just inside the frame of his front door, the warmth of his cabin curling at the edges of his back while cold wind and rain bit at his face. The storm had battered the land for hours, and most nights he would have bolted the door tight by sundown, drawn the curtains and shut out the world like he had for the past 7 years. But now, a trembling voice reached him through the wind, a voice so desperate, so raw, it stopped the door from closing. 10 women stood in the storm, their faces pale from cold, cloaks soaked and clinging, eyes wide not with fear but with exhaustion and something deeper. A woman stepped forward. She was young, no older than his Clara would have been. Her name, she said, was Sani. Her voice wavered as she spoke, though not from weakness. It was the sound of someone who'd run too far, lost too much, and found themselves at the mercy of a stranger's choice. They weren't thieves, she said, not beggars. They were fleeing death, and his ranch was the only place left between them and the soldiers behind them. Jeremiah's hand rested on the doorframe, knuckles white. He wanted to close it. Every instinct, every scar etched into his soul screamed at him to shut them out. The last time he offered kindness to someone in trouble, it had cost him his wife and their unborn child. He had trusted a wounded man who came to his gate with a bloodied leg and a soft story. That same man returned with 2 others after midnight. Jeremiah hadn't made it to his rifle in time. He buried them both at the tree line the next morning, then built the fence higher and spoke to no one again. But Sani's eyes, God. Her eyes held something he couldn't ignore, not just fear but fire. Like she was holding her ground even as the world threatened to wash her away. She didn't beg. She didn't weep. She just asked for one night, for dry shelter, for a door not slammed in her face. He took a breath, long and bitter, then stepped back. The women filed in one by one, leaving puddles on the wood floor and steam rising from their shoulders. He didn't ask questions, just pointed toward the fire and brought out every spare quilt he owned. The room filled with silence, punctuated only by the snapping of wet fabric and soft murmurs in their native tongue. Jeremiah remained near the hearth, eyes sharp, hands never straying far from the rifle resting against the mantel. Sani sat closest to him, more out of caution than comfort. After a while, once the others had warmed enough to doze, she began to speak again low and measured, as though afraid the storm might carry her words away. The soldiers chasing them weren't after criminals. They were silencing survivors. A captain named Harlan Boone had led a charge on their village without warning, burned homes, cut down men and boys alike, and now hunted the remaining women who saw too much. Sani and the 9 others had escaped through a river and hadn't stopped moving since. Every time they slept, they risked discovery. Every time they knocked, they risked being turned in. They had come to Jeremiah's ranch not by accident. Word on the wind was that a man lived out here alone. No ties, no loyalties, just a cabin buried deep in the hills. To Sani, that sounded like safety. To Jeremiah, it sounded like trouble. He stared into the fire, letting the heat seep into his face while her story burrowed into his chest. He didn't want to care. He'd worked so damn hard not to care for so long. But something about this moment cracked the armor he'd built. Maybe it was the way Sani never once asked for pity. Maybe it was the familiar echo of grief in her voice. Or maybe, deep down, he knew that if he turned them out, he'd be no better than the men chasing them. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he kept watch. At some point before dawn, he walked the perimeter, boots sinking into muddy soil, breath coming in frosty bursts. The fence still held. The barn was quiet. In the distance, beyond the ridgeline, he thought he saw a flicker of lantern light, maybe a patrol, maybe nothing. But it reminded him of what he had invited into his life. He had opened his door not just to 10 strangers, but to everything that followed them. When he returned inside, Sani was still awake, seated in a chair near the fire, wrapped in a blanket too big for her frame. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. "You didn't have to let us in," she whispered. "No," he said, "I didn't. You'll be in danger now." "I've been living with danger for years," he replied. "At least now I'm not hiding from it." The silence that followed felt heavier than before, but no longer empty. It was the silence of two people who understood that sometimes doing the right thing hurts more than doing nothing. And sometimes it's the only thing left that makes you feel human. As the wind howled outside and the fire crackled low in the hearth, the warmth inside the cabin did little to erase the tension that filled the room. Alina sat across from Jonah Whitaker, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the flicker of flames that danced in the dim light. The other women, 9 of them, rested around the room, draped in quilts, some already asleep, some pretending to be. Alina hadn't spoken much since Jonah let them in. But now, as the hour crept closer to midnight, her voice rose softly, cutting through the quiet with unexpected weight. "They're not chasing us because we're dangerous," she said, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug of tea he'd given her earlier. "They're chasing us because we saw what they did." Jonah leaned forward slightly. He hadn't asked questions when they first arrived. He'd given them food, warmth, and shelter, but kept a watchful distance. Now, he listened, the silence between her words heavier than any storm. She told him everything, not in dramatics, not with rage, but with a measured calm that only comes from someone who's repeated the story enough times to feel every word in their bones. Their village, hidden deep beyond the canyon's reach, had lived quietly for years. They didn't raid, didn't provoke, didn't threaten, but that hadn't mattered to Captain Leonard Harlan, the man in charge of the patrol lines in the territory. He'd wanted to send a message, one of dominance, of fear, of control. Alina described how, without warning, soldiers arrived at dusk, surrounding the village before a single warning shot was fired. Homes were torched, livestock slaughtered, and people, men, women, children were cut down in the dust without mercy. It wasn't a skirmish. It wasn't war. It was execution. Alina's voice cracked when she spoke of the children. How they ran, barefoot and terrified, clutching the hands of their mothers, only to fall under gunfire. She didn't cry. Not then. Not even as her fingers trembled slightly. Jonah sat motionless, jaw tight, hands clasped in front of him. He had fought in wars, had worn a uniform, but even he hadn't heard of tactics as brutal as the ones she described. The most harrowing part wasn't the attack itself, but what came after. Captain Harlan hadn't been content to simply destroy. He needed to bury the truth. The survivors, those who had escaped into the woods or hidden beneath floorboards, had to be found and silenced. Alina and the women with her had seen too much. They had witnessed the faces of the soldiers, had heard them laugh while the flames devoured everything. They'd seen Captain Harlan himself set fire to the council house where elders had once gathered. They'd watched him shoot a boy no older than 10 just to prove a point to his men. And now, those same men were hunting them. Not under lawful orders, not for justice, but to clean up what should have remained hidden. Jonah stared at the wooden floor, the grain of the planks blurring under the weight of what he'd heard. He had lived out here for years to escape violence, to avoid politics and broken chains of command. He'd stopped believing in justice the day the war ended and no one was held accountable for what had been done in uniform. And yet, here it was again, truth clawing at his doorstep, asking not for judgment, but simply to be heard. Alina paused for a long time, then looked up. "We're not fugitives," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't steal or kill or revolt. We just didn't die when we were supposed to." That sentence hung in the room like smoke. Jonah let out a long breath, rubbed a hand across his face, and stood up slowly. He moved to the small cabinet near the back wall and pulled out a faded tin box. Inside was a stack of old papers, a broken compass, and a photograph nearly worn white with time. He stared at it for a second, then set it aside. "I had a daughter," he said finally. "She would have been about your age now. If she were alive." Alina didn't speak. She died because someone thought they could get away with something, and no one ever paid for it. He turned toward her then, his voice low. "I don't know what you expect from me. I'm not a sheriff or a judge. I don't have men or weapons or answers. But I know what's right. And what they're doing to you that ain't right." Alina nodded once, slow and steady. "We don't need you to fix the world. We just need a place to stand while we try." And in that moment, Jonah understood the truth wasn't just in her words, it was in their presence, in the firelight reflecting in tired eyes, in the silence of women who had already lost too much. They didn't come asking to be saved. They came refusing to be erased. At first glance, the women seemed broken by the cold and the long chase, wrapped in damp shawls and silence. Silas Hart had welcomed them into his home not out of charity but from something older and quieter, maybe guilt, maybe memory, or maybe just a buried sense of decency he thought long gone. They moved carefully around the cabin, taking up corners near the hearth, folding wet garments, accepting the warmth without thanks or questions. But by the time the fire had burned low and the wind outside turned from wild to steady, Silas began to notice things that didn't fit. One of them, the tallest, was sweeping the floor with precision, her eyes darting between the door and the window as if tracking invisible movement. Another had gone outside briefly and returned without a word, but her boots were muddy in a specific pattern, a looping path that suggested reconnaissance more than relief. The smallest one never left her spot by the stove, but she had a knife hidden beneath her sleeve. Silas caught the glint once as she turned her arm, and she didn't flinch when their eyes met. None of them did. There was no cowering, no tremble of victims. Their silence wasn't fear, it was strategy. Later that night, as Silas stepped outside to check the barn, he found one of the women on the roof. Her silhouette was still against the moonlight, lying flat, watching the southern tree line through a spyglass made of polished bone and glass. She didn't hide. She didn't speak. She just lowered the glass, met his eyes, and nodded once. No apology, no excuse. She was watching for something or someone. Back inside, Silas sat in his old wooden chair, his back to the wall. He had lived alone for too long not to feel when something in the air changed. These women hadn't stumbled onto his ranch by accident. They'd chosen it, chosen him. And as the hours passed, the unspoken truth between them began to settle like dust. These weren't survivors looking for protection. These were fighters preparing for a stand. He stayed quiet until the fire died down to coals. Then he asked, not to accuse, but to understand. Why here? It was Alina, the woman who had spoken to him first, who answered. She didn't hesitate. Because you live too far out for help to arrive quickly. Because your land is open enough to see them coming. Because you have fences, elevation, and 2 good escape routes, and because you once served in the Union Army, you know how to hold ground. Silas didn't deny it. He looked at her, at the 9 others, now all watching him with calm, ready eyes. It struck him then not a single one had asked him to fight. Not one plea, not one assumption. They had studied him, judged him, and still let him choose for himself. Alina stepped forward, unwrapping a small bundle from her satchel. Inside was a rolled map hand-drawn, annotated in symbols and notches. It showed the surrounding area, the patrol routes, the distances from the nearest town, water sources, even the wind direction. It was the kind of detail that came not from desperation but from training. "We're not just running," she said. "We're making a line they won't cross." Silas looked at the map, then at the fire, then at his own calloused hands. He remembered once holding maps like this years ago, in meetings filled with commanders and decisions that sent young men to die. Now, decades later, in a room filled with women who had seen their homes burned and their children hunted, he held a map that would decide something else entirely. "You planning to make a last stand?" he asked. "No," she said. "We plan to win. Or disappear, but not die like prey." He leaned back in his chair. His heart ached from the truth in her words. But he didn't feel sorrow. He felt awe. In a world that tried to break them, they had sharpened instead. By dawn, the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It had become a command post. 2 women worked silently, reinforcing shutters with spare wood. Another dug shallow trenches near the chicken coop, hiding narrow spikes beneath leaves. Alina climbed the ridge behind the barn and marked vantage points. They moved like a unit, coordinated, efficient, prepared. Not hardened like soldiers, but tempered like iron. Silas didn't speak much that day. He didn't have to. Every nail he hammered, every board he shifted, every rifle he cleaned was his answer. He wasn't saving anyone. He was standing beside them. When the wind shifted that evening and the horses in the corral began to stir, Alina gave a single nod to one of the women by the window. No panic, no retreat. They had chosen this battleground not to die, but to draw a line in the dust. And now, so had he. The first shot came just before dawn, tearing through the brittle silence like a hammer splitting wood. It struck the far window of the cabin, shattering glass and embedding in the beam above the hearth. Cal Morgan had been waiting for it all night. He rose from behind the overturned table with his rifle already in hand, heart pounding not from fear, but from the focus of a man who'd faced too much to flinch anymore. Outside, hooves thundered through the frost-hardened ground as Captain Rourke and his men surrounded the cabin. Inside, there was no panic. The women were already in position. Layla, the tallest, crouched near the back door with a short-barreled shotgun loaded and steady. Nara and Elsie were upstairs, covering the loft windows. Alani knelt beside Cal, her calm eyes locked on the front door. They weren't just hiding, they were waiting. The second shot hit the door. Then came the barked orders outside, a voice soaked in arrogance shouting for them to come out. Cal recognized it instantly. Rourke, the same man who had ordered entire families into the fire back at Dustwood Hollow. The same man who had lied to Congress and paid off local lawmen. And now he stood 20 yards away. Believing he had cornered the last loose ends, Cal glanced at Alani, who gave a single nod. It was time. He shifted left, firing 2 quick shots through the cracked front window. Screams echoed outside as a soldier dropped. Layla burst through the back door in a blur, firing from the hip. The narrow gap between the house and the woods became a choke point, exactly as they'd planned. The soldiers weren't expecting resistance, especially not from a group they thought were broken women and a washed-up rancher. What they got was precision. Nara fired from above, picking off a rider as he circled wide. Elsie dropped a smoke bomb near the well, clouding the southern approach. Cal stepped out the front, ducking behind the water trough as he reloaded. It was chaos, but it was controlled. Every window had been reinforced, every exit calculated. The women didn't scream. They didn't panic. They fought like people with nothing left to lose but a shred of truth no one else had dared to carry. Captain Rourke pushed forward through the smoke, cursing and swinging his saber wildly. He shot at shadows, shouted for his men to press in, but the tide had already shifted. Alani stepped out from behind the barn, her boots silent in the dirt, her revolver aimed with calm fury. Cal saw her before Rourke did. The shot rang out once. Rourke staggered. He turned, surprised she was real, as though he couldn't believe the hands that pulled a trigger were the same ones that once tended fires and buried children. He tried to lift his weapon, but Layla was already behind him. Her blade flashed once through the mist. Rourke collapsed, blood blooming in the dust like spilled ink. It wasn't rage that killed him. It was justice. When the gunfire faded, only silence remained. The few surviving soldiers fled into the hills, dragging their wounded, leaving behind the dead and the truth they'd tried to erase. The ground was scorched. Smoke curled from the edge of the fence where a wagon had burned. The cabin bore bullet holes and shattered glass, but it still stood. Inside, Cal lowered his rifle and leaned against the doorframe, watching as the women moved among the fallen. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They collected weapons. They covered the faces of the dead. They buried their own quietly behind the stable. Alani stood still for a long while over Rourke's body, saying nothing, her expression unreadable. Al walked over to her. "It's done," he said softly. She looked up at him. "No," she replied. "This part is done. But it's far from over." He understood what she meant. One battle wasn't the end. The real fight, the one for the truth to be heard, for names to be cleared, for those who gave orders to be held accountable, that fight was just beginning. But for now, they had survived, not as victims, not as fugitives, but as people who refused to be erased. That night, they lit no lanterns. They sat around the fire in silence, the kind shared by those who have seen death up close and dared to keep going anyway. Cal passed around a tin of coffee. No one toasted, no one needed to. They had done what they came to do. And in the stillness, as wind carried the scent of ash and pine, Cal looked at Alani. And for the first time in years, he felt like a man who hadn't just lived through history but helped bend it. The smoke hadn't yet cleared when the second column arrived. Silas Brenner was standing near the edge of the barn, rifle across his chest, watching the last of the riders disappear over the ridge, when the dull thud of new hooves rolled across the valley like distant thunder. At first, he thought it might have been stragglers from the skirmish they had just survived. But then the banner came into view, black and red, the mark of Colonel Everett Langston, a man whose name had traveled through the territories like a curse whispered around campfires. Silas stepped back from the fence line, eyes narrowing. He made his way back to the house where the others were already regrouping. Elia, one of the women who had fought beside him, met him at the porch with her jaw tight and shoulders squared. "It's him," she said, not needing to ask. "Langston," Silas gave a slight nod. "Looks like 50, maybe 60 men. Wagons, too. They've come for cleanup." Inside, the house had become a map room, a place of hushed voices and fast decisions. The surviving women had circled around the table, laying out sketches of the terrain, escape routes, and old mining tunnels beneath the East Ridge. Silas pointed to the valley entrance. "If we collapse the bridge, they won't reach the front yard. If we use the dynamite here, it'll bury half of them." Elia leaned in, tracing the ridgeline with her finger. "Too risky. We'd need precise timing. We've got the wire, and I know the fuse," Silas said. "It's either this or we wait to get surrounded." But before another word could be spoken, a voice rose from the other side of the room. It was Mira, the youngest of the group, barely 20, but already with eyes that had seen more than most men twice her age. "You all need to see something," she said, pointing toward the spyglass on the windowsill. Silas stepped up and looked through it. Down in the enemy camp, not far from the second wagon, a woman in a white bonnet cradled a baby. The infant squirmed, arms reaching toward the sky, then let out a cry that was barely audible through the glass. But even from this distance, the sound seemed to pierce right through him. He pulled back slowly. "There's a child down there," he said. The room fell into silence. One by one, the others came to see. A mother, perhaps a cook or laundress, brought along to serve the officers. Maybe she thought she'd be kept safe. Maybe she didn't know what these men were capable of. Silas stared down at the lines drawn on the map. The dynamite was already placed. The trigger mechanism had been set. One pull and half the field would vanish in fire. But that cry, soft, pure, unaware, cut through every plan they'd made. He sat down hard in the chair near the fireplace, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We can't do it. Not with that child down there." "You sure?" Elia asked. "We don't strike now, we might not get another chance." Silas looked at her, not as a comrade, but as a father who had buried his own child many winters ago. "If I pull that wire and that baby dies, I'm not better than the men who killed your families. We swore we'd survive, but not by becoming what we hate." The room held its breath. Finally, Elia gave a small nod. "Then we changed the plan." What followed was a scramble unlike any they had planned. A new route was drawn, one that would lead a smaller team through the backwoods and into the enemy camp's flank. Mira and two others would create a diversion with smoke bombs and oil-soaked fabric near the supply wagon. Silas, Elia, and a woman named Ray would move through the ravine, using the tall grass and low light to get close. They waited until dusk, when the sun dipped just enough to cast shadows over the hills. Mira struck the first flare behind the grain cart. The flash drew half the soldiers to the fire, shouting orders and dragging buckets. Meanwhile, Silas and Elia slipped past the lower fence, quiet as breath. They moved through thorns and pine needles, closer to the small tent where the woman held her child. Silas whispered her name, though he didn't know it. The woman turned, startled, eyes wide with fear. Elia raised her hands slowly, palms open. "We're not here to hurt you," she said softly. "We need you to follow us. Now." The woman clutched her baby tighter, glanced once toward the chaos in the camp, then nodded. They made it out with barely a whisper. Looping back through the ravine, the flare had drawn more attention than expected, and shots rang out behind them, but none came close. By the time they returned to the cabin, the child was asleep in his mother's arms. Safe. Silas didn't speak as he sat back on the porch and watching the stars flicker into view. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, they had chosen not to kill, and somehow that mattered more than winning. It meant they still had something worth defending. As dusk fell across the battered prairie, Gideon Wells crouched low in the tall grass, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouettes of soldiers moving around their campfires. The sky above had dimmed to a muted orange, but down below, the flames flickering from the supply wagons and tents threw strange shadows across the valley. Just hours earlier, they'd nearly pulled the trigger on the dynamite wired beneath the ridge. It would have ended the threat in a single thunderous blast except for one sound that changed everything: a baby's cry from within the enemy's camp. That cry had silenced every hand near the trigger. It wasn't just a child, it was a reminder of what they were, of what they weren't willing to become. Now, instead of fire and destruction, Gideon was leading something far riskier: a silent, strategic assault through the rear of the encampment, meant to disable without killing, to extract without carnage. Ayasha and her team would create the diversion. They had torches, oil, and the advantage of night. Gideon had speed, instinct, and the weight of knowing this might be the last move they'd ever get to make. He turned to his small team: Mira, lean and sharp-eyed, already uncoiling the lengths of rope they'd used to restrain the guards. Jonah, steady with a blade but more deadly with silence, and Dea, the fastest of them all, who carried nothing but 2 small blades and a pouch of powder meant to blind and burn. Gideon gave the signal, a flick of 2 fingers, and they moved. Down through the ravine, past the charred remains of old brush. They slipped like shadows between the sloped rocks and moonlit trees. In the distance, a sudden flare burst upward. Ayasha's team had lit the outer fencing near the horses. Shouts erupted almost instantly. Soldiers scrambled to form ranks, confused by the direction of the flames. Gideon and his crew moved faster. They reached the far end of the camp just as the men guarding the supply wagons turned their backs to help douse the fire. Dea went first, tossing a small pouch of white ash into the nearest guard's face. He crumpled, coughing and blinded. Jonah moved next, wrapping his arm around the second guard's neck, easing him to the ground before he could utter a sound. Mira swept behind the final man, binding his wrists with a practiced pull. It was over in less than 30 seconds. They moved in formation toward the row of tents behind the wagons. Somewhere in the third tent, according to the scout's earlier report, was the camp cook, a young woman and her child, brought along not for battle, but to serve the officers with meals and linen. She wasn't a fighter, and Gideon wasn't going to let her die in the crossfire of someone else's war. He pulled back the flap quietly. Inside, the woman sat hunched near a small basin, rocking a bundled infant in her arms. Her eyes met his immediately wide, alarmed, but not panicked. Her instincts flared as any mother's would. "Please don't scream," Gideon said in a whisper, lowering his weapon. "We're here to get you out. We're not like them." She looked past him, to Mira and Jonah standing behind, faces marked with urgency, not cruelty. The baby stirred but didn't cry. "They said I was safe," she said quietly. Gideon's face hardened. "They lied." She stood slowly, clutching the baby against her chest. Mira stepped forward and wrapped a blanket over the child, dulling the color, concealing the movement. Outside, the fire was growing. Shouting intensified. One soldier ran past the tent without even noticing them. Time was short. The group began to retreat the same way they came back, through the shadows and up the slope behind the camp. But just as they reached the edge of the ravine, a stray beam of lantern light flashed across them. A guard shouted. Jonah turned and threw a blade, striking the man in the leg. He collapsed with a muffled grunt, but the alert was out. "Move!" Gideon growled. They raced up the incline, the mother stumbling once, but Gideon caught her arm. They didn't stop until they reached the tree line where Ayasha waited. Breath ragged, clothes singed from the diversion, she saw the baby first, and the fire in her eyes flickered with something close to relief. They made it. Mira gasped. Ayasha nodded. And the camp's in chaos. They'll be looking the wrong direction for hours. Back at the cabin, as the group regrouped beneath the stars, Gideon stood watch on the porch, his rifle across his lap, eyes never resting. The cook held her child beside the hearth, whispering lullabies beneath her breath. No one spoke of what could have happened had they chosen the easier path. In saving a single life, they had preserved something even rarer, mercy in a time of war. And Gideon, whose hands had once known only loss, felt, for the first time in years, that he had fought for something worth carrying forward. The gunfire had barely died down when Elia spotted movement near the wagon overturned at the far edge of the clearing. Smoke still hung low over the field, curling through broken fence posts and blood-stained grass, but she moved quickly, rifle raised, breath sharp with adrenaline. As she drew closer, she saw him, a boy, no older than 16, clutching his side, one boot missing, uniform half burned. He tried to lift a pistol, but it slipped from his trembling hand. Elia kicked it aside and yanked him to his feet. His eyes burned with fear and shame, not for being caught, but because he knew exactly what had just happened. Back at the cabin, when she dragged him through the door and tossed him to the floor, everyone fell silent. The boy groaned, clutching his ribs, and Ayasha stepped forward, eyes narrowed, recognizing him instantly. "That's Elijah Bradley," she said coldly, Colonel Bradley's only son. The weight of the name settled like stone on the room. They all knew what it meant. Colonel Jedediah Bradley, the man responsible for raising villages, executing families, and hunting survivors like animals. The man who had sent every last patrol into these hills, convinced no one would dare fight back. And now, his son lay bruised and bleeding on the floor of their refuge. Some of the women stepped closer, their faces hard. "Ray, whose sister had died in the fires at Pine Ridge, clenched her fists. She said nothing, but the way she stared at the boy made her thoughts plain. Dea whispered something sharp in her native tongue, and Mira stood stone-faced behind her. They had lost too much to flinch at the idea of vengeance. Ayasha looked to Silas Modum, who leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes were heavy with thought, but he hadn't moved, not until he saw the flicker of a blade in Elia's hand. "Wait," he said. She turned slowly, face taut. "Why?" "Because this might be our only chance to do more than survive," Silas replied. He stepped into the center of the room and where the boy lay gasping. "You know who we are," he said to the boy. "You know what your father did. Then tell us why you were with them." Elijah's lips parted, blood on his teeth. "I was just delivering orders. I didn't shoot anyone." "You rode with them," Ray said through clenched teeth. "You wore their colors." "I didn't know," Elijah whispered. "I didn't know they'd do that." "Liar!" Dea spat. Silas raised his hand. "He's young, scared. But he can give us something his father never would, truth." The room erupted in voices, accusations, demands, bitter reminders of the bodies they'd buried. Silas let them speak. He knew they had earned their anger. But when the voices faded, he spoke again. "We kill him now, and we're no different than them. His death will be buried, twisted, used to justify more slaughter. But if he testifies, if he stands in front of men in Washington or at Fort Garland and says what he saw, we have a chance to turn this tide. And if he lies," Mira asked bitterly, "then we lose what little hope we've built. But I'm not ready to give up on hope yet," Silas replied. Ayasha looked at Elijah. "Do you even care about what your father's done?" He looked up at her, tears mingling with dirt and ash on his cheeks. "He doesn't talk about it. I was just supposed to bring a message. I never knew what they'd done to your people until we got here. I swear it. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't defiance either. It was fear tangled with the first threads of guilt. That night, they bound Elijah's hands not to punish, but to ensure safety." Ayasha sat watch beside him, asking questions, not with fury but with sharp clarity. Who issued the orders? Where were the next patrols headed? What did Bradley plan next? The boy answered slowly at first, then faster, as if the weight of truth had become easier to carry once it started to fall. In the morning, they fed him from the same pot of stew they shared, Dwight, and Mira handed him a blanket without a word. No one trusted him, not yet, but they didn't beat him, and they didn't kill him. That restraint became their victory. As the sun rose over the battered valley, Silas stood outside, staring toward the horizon. Ayasha joined him. "You think we did the right thing?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think we gave ourselves a chance, and sometimes that's all you can ask for." Behind them, Elijah sat quietly by the hearth, rubbing his bound wrists, the flickering fire painting his face with light and shadow. Whether he'd become a witness or a traitor was still uncertain, but they had chosen mercy, and with it, the hope that justice might one day follow. The night passed with uneasy quiet, broken only by the low rustle of wind through the trees and the soft crackle of fire in the hearth. Inside the cabin, no one slept deeply. The boy, Jacob Bradley, son of the infamous Colonel Langston Bradley, sat near the wall, his hands bound but his eyes wide open, staring into the embers as if trying to burn away everything he'd witnessed. The others kept their distance, not because they feared him, but because they were still wrestling with what to do with him. Alara stood near the window, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. She'd lost 2 brothers in the raids led by Colonel Bradley's men. Ray, seated on the floor cleaning a rifle, still had the scars from the ambush that wiped out her village. Every woman in that room had a reason to want blood, and Jacob, though young, wore the same uniform that had haunted their nights for years. But Gideon Wells, who had once fought in a war that taught him what hatred could turn a man into, stood between them and vengeance. He had argued the night before, not with fire but with reason, that killing the boy would serve no justice. "If we spill his blood now," he had said, We bury the truth with it. But if he speaks, if he stands before the law and tells what he knows, we have a chance to make what's right count for something. And now the decision sat heavy on everyone's shoulders. As dawn approached, Ilara finally stepped forward and crouched beside the boy. "Do you even understand what your father did?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Jacob didn't look at her. "He told me it was all necessary, that the villages were harboring threats, that the killings kept others safe." Ilara's voice broke. "Did he show you the burned bodies the children shot while they slept?" Jacob shook his head slowly. "No. He just told me not to ask questions." Gideon stepped in then. "Well, you're going to answer some now. What did you see? What orders did you carry? What names did you hear?" Jacob hesitated, but something in Gideon's tone made him sit straighter. There was a ledger. He kept it hidden in a lockbox coded, I think. He took it with him every time he went to Washington. He said it was protection, that if anything happened, no one would touch him as long as the right people stayed quiet. Ray leaned in. "Names, I don't remember them all, just important people, army officers, judges, a few businessmen from Chicago. There was money involved. Always." "And what about the raids?" Ilara pressed. "Did you see what happened at Red Hollow?" Jacob swallowed hard. "I didn't know the full story then. I just passed messages. I didn't ask." "But you saw it," Gideon said. He nodded. "Yes, I saw the flames. I saw men laughing while they fired into the houses. There was a long silence. No one moved. No one needed to. They all knew what had to happen next. Just as the first rays of light crept over the ridge, the sound of hooves broke the morning calm. Dozens of them, not the chaos of charging soldiers, but the measured discipline of an organized unit. Gideon stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung but hands visible. Down the road came a line of horses bearing blue coats and brass badges, federal agents. Not military men. Their leader, a man with silver hair and a steely jaw, dismounted with a document in hand. Marshal Ethan Graves. He said, "We received reports of unlawful militia activity and war crimes tied to Colonel Langston Bradley. We've been tracking him for months." Gideon glanced back toward the cabin. "You're a little late, but the boy inside can give you everything you need." Graves raised a brow. "Bradley's son. He saw it all. He's ready to talk." The agents entered carefully, taking the boy without force. He didn't resist. As they led him out, he paused at the door, turning back toward Ilara and Ray. "I didn't know before," he said, "but I know now. And I'll tell them everything." Neither woman replied, but neither reached for a weapon either. 2 hours later, news came through the marshal's telegraph unit. Colonel Bradley had been apprehended at a private estate 15 miles east, trying to flee with forged papers and a satchel of gold. With his son's testimony and the ledgers found in his possession, the case would be airtight. Back at the cabin, as the sun climbed higher and the smoke of yesterday's battle finally cleared, Gideon stood with Ilara on the porch. "Think they'll believe him?" she asked. "They won't have a choice," Gideon said. "He's the last person they'd expect to speak against his father. And you think it's justice?" Gideon watched the dust trail of the departing riders. "It's not enough for all we lost, but it's a start." And for the first time in a long while, they felt like the truth had a voice louder than vengeance. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the scorched earth that had once been a quiet homestead tucked away in the high plains. Smoke still curled lazily from what remained of the barn, and the fences lay shattered, splintered like old bones. But amid the ruin, there was movement, deliberate, quiet, and full of resolve. Ayasha stood at the edge of the field, her eyes scanning the horizon where distant riders were now fading into morning light. The federal agents had done their part, promising protection, supplies, and safe passage for the surviving Apache women. For once, their words came with action. Wagons had been loaded with tools, grain, and medical supplies. The women would have a chance at rebuilding, at healing, at something close to peace. Beside her, Ray adjusted the strap on her satchel, glancing back toward the smoldering remains of the cabin. "You sure you don't want to come with us?" she asked gently. Ayasha shook her head. "This part of my journey ends here. Where I go next, I have to walk alone." Ray didn't press. She simply reached out, squeezed her friend's arm once, then turned to join the others. One by one, the women mounted their horses, and without fanfare or farewell, they rode off toward the open land where a new home might rise from ash. Tobias Callahan stood a few yards back, watching them disappear. His home, once a place of quiet routine, where silence and guilt had ruled his every waking moment, was now a charred shell. But he didn't mourn its loss. That house had held him prisoner to memories he could no longer afford to live inside. What remained was a choice, one he hadn't expected to make until the world forced his hand. A soft cry behind him drew his attention. Mary was trying to settle her baby, gently bouncing the child in her arms while scanning the debris for something usable. Her clothes were torn, her cheeks smudged with dirt, but her presence held the kind of quiet strength Tobias hadn't seen in years. She had lost everything: her home, her safety, her trust, and yet here she stood, upright, defiant in her softness. Tobias walked over, his boots crunching over ash and broken glass. "I found your satchel," he said, holding out the worn leather bag she'd arrived with. She took it with a grateful nod, adjusting the baby against her shoulder. "I don't know where I'm going," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said the fort can place us somewhere safe, but I don't know what that looks like." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then let me take you there." She blinked, surprised. "You've already lost everything because of us." "I didn't lose anything worth keeping," he said. "Not compared to what you've held on to." They stood in silence for a beat. Then she nodded once, slowly. "All right." They left that afternoon. Tobias hitched the last remaining mule to a wagon salvaged from the barn. He packed what little food remained: a canteen, a few tools, and the rifle that had seen him through both war and peace. Mary sat beside him, the baby cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket stitched by one of the Apache women before they'd left. The road ahead was long, winding through hills and shallow rivers, past small towns that still looked sideways at strangers, and toward a fort that promised protection, though not necessarily welcome. But as they traveled, something shifted in Tobias. The weight in his chest, the one that had settled there the day his wife and daughter died, didn't feel quite as crushing. It didn't disappear, but it softened. Like a wound learning how to close. Mary talked sometimes, mostly about simple things: the baby's name, the scent of her grandmother's bread, a song she remembered from childhood. Tobias listened, not because he needed distraction, but because he needed to be reminded of the ordinary beauty that still existed in the world. On the third night, they camped near a creek. Tobias built a fire, and Mary laid the baby down in a woven basket she'd lined with scarves. They ate in quiet comfort, passing a tin of beans between them, each spoonful shared like a promise. The fire cast warm light over their faces, and for the first time in years, Tobias found himself smiling, not forced, not polite, but real. "You're not the man I expected," Mary said suddenly, watching him from across the fire. He looked up. "I'm not the man I used to be." She nodded slowly. "That's not a bad thing." He glanced toward the baby, now asleep, tiny fists resting against chubby cheeks. "Do you think he'll remember any of this?" "No," she said softly. "But I hope he'll grow up knowing that kindness can come from the darkest places." Tobias poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers rise. "Then maybe we've done something right." In the distance, coyotes howled and the stars blinked awake one by one. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the past couldn't be undone. But as Tobias leaned back against the wagon wheel, with Mary beside him and a child whose life had just begun, he understood something he hadn't known in years. He wasn't running from his past anymore. He was walking towards something. Years passed, and the land slowly healed. The scorched fields near the old homestead were overtaken by tall grass and wildflowers, and the broken fences disappeared beneath ivy and dust. Travelers passed through, sometimes pausing near the remnants of an old cabin, its stones still standing beneath the wind. Locals told stories of a rancher who once lived alone, of 10 Apache women who found shelter and rose like fire against an army, of a stormy night when the valley echoed with gunfire and the air burned with justice. The tale traveled far beyond the borders of that forgotten stretch of prairie. It was whispered in saloons, written into journals, even retold around army campfires by men who didn't know whether to believe it. And though the names were often lost in retellings or replaced by myth, the legend endured. But for those who had lived it, those who had breathed in the smoke, carried the wounded, and buried the dead, the truth was not in the legend. The truth was quieter, deeper. It wasn't about heroism or victory. It wasn't about strategy or cleverness or who fired the last shot. The truth, as Gideon Wells would later write in a letter never sent, was about something far more fragile and far more powerful, about choosing to stay human when the world begged you to become something else. Gideon lived out his later years in a small frontier town near the foothills, working as a carpenter and quietly fixing things that others had given up on. He rarely spoke of the battle or the people he had fought beside. But every year, on the same spring day, he would ride out alone to the edge of the valley, where the old ash tree still stood, and leave behind a carved token, a bird, a flower, a star. He never explained why, but those who knew him understood it was a remembrance, not just of those lost, but of who he had once been and who he had chosen to become. Ayasha, too, disappeared from public memory, though whispers of her surfaced in surprising places. A teacher in a remote settlement who spoke 5 languages fluently, a woman healer who traveled with a weathered satchel full of salves and stories, a quiet voice at treaty councils who never took credit but always guided outcomes with wisdom no one could argue against. She had not survived to be celebrated. She had survived to ensure others might not have to endure what she had. The other women each carried their own paths forward, some settling in small communities under new names, others returning to their people, helping rebuild homes and customs torn apart by war. Their legacy wasn't carved in monuments or written in textbooks. It lived in the children they taught, the peace they preserved, and the choices they made each day to walk a little farther away from hate. As for Mary, she raised her child in a quiet house far from where it all began. The boy never knew the worst of it, though he saw the scars his mother carried and understood early that life often turns on a single act of mercy. When he asked about the man who had helped them escape, Mary would smile faintly and tell him about a man who had every reason to give up, but chose instead to begin again. The story, in its truest form, was never about war. It was about a choice made in a moment when it would have been easier to hate, easier to kill, easier to run. Gideon had chosen to open his door. Ayasha had chosen to speak the truth. Mary had chosen to trust. And when the smoke cleared and the blood was washed from the earth, what remained was not vengeance or glory, but something far more rare, the will to live without becoming bitter. Somewhere, in a military archive, an official report marks the incident as a minor engagement on contested land. But somewhere else, perhaps in a song sung by a grandmother to her grandchild, or in the way a teacher places her hand gently on a frightened child's shoulder, the real story lives on. It is not loud, it does not demand recognition, but it is enduring. Because when the world around you burns, when power tries to strip away your name, your home, your hope, the act of choosing kindness, of standing for justice even when you're afraid, becomes a legacy more powerful than any bullet or title. The land remembers, the wind carries the echoes, and long after the names are forgotten, the truth remains quiet, steady, and alive in those who still believe that doing what's right is worth everything. This story reminds us that even in life's darkest chapters, the choices we make define who we truly are. For older generations who have seen the world change through hardship, war, and personal loss, this tale reaffirms a timeless truth: mercy is not weakness, and dignity can prevail over vengeance. The rancher, once isolated by grief, chose compassion over hatred and found purpose again. The Apache women, scarred but resilient, stood not only for survival but for justice and truth. These characters did not let trauma turn them cruel, they chose humanity instead. For seniors reflecting on their own legacies, this message resonates deeply. Life offers us moments where we must decide between bitterness and grace. As we age, it becomes clear that the most powerful legacy we can leave behind is not wealth or titles, but kindness in the face of pain, and courage in the presence of injustice. Whether it's comforting a neighbor, sharing hard-won wisdom with family, or forgiving someone who once wronged us, these small acts echo far beyond our years. Just like in the story, it's never too late to be part of something healing, something greater than ourselves.